Hollow Knight is a game that has been close to my heart ever since I fully completed it for the first time. If you've been following my channel for some time, you'll know that I love Metroidvanias, especially Hollow Knight, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone at this point. Hollow Knight is my favorite game that I have ever played, and you might be wondering, why this game? What is so special about this game that me and many other people love and adore? Simple. Hollow Knight is one of the most beautiful, fun, memorable, and dare I say touching games that was made only by 3 people. It is a game that does so many things right without feeling half-baked or unnecessary. From its beautiful world to the excellent exploration, great combat system, phenomenal lore, memorable characters, and the soundtrack that sticks with you even after you finish the game. Everything about this game is just brilliant. Traversing through the decrepit and dying kingdom of Hollownest and uncovering many secrets it holds is an experience that will stick with me for the rest of my life. Today, it is finally time to talk about Hollow Knight and why it is a masterpiece that everyone should play and experience it for themselves. Hollow Knight's world is one of the most memorable and cohesive worlds ever created. It is a world full of secrets, questions, and mysteries that will make the player intrigued into finding out the reasons for many of these questions. Like, what or who caused the downfall of this large kingdom? Why are many residents of this kingdom hostile while some aren't? What are these masks on this structure? Who is this person in the intro and why are they chained up? These are the questions and mysteries that the game expertly sets up and makes the player intrigued. The world of Hollow Knight is, without exaggeration, one of the best crafted worlds I've seen in a video game. Is it the best? Very debatable. But you can't deny that the world of Hollownest is excellently crafted with so much love and care. The areas are distinct not only in colors, but in the designs, lighting, and theming. The game's first area, the Forgotten Crossroads, will start with a dark atmosphere covered with shades of dark blue and white, while a very somber music plays in the background, setting the stage of this dying land. But this doesn't apply to all of the areas. Each area is presented with different color palette to set them apart from previous areas. Most notably is once you leave the Forgotten Crossroads and enter into Green Path, where scenery drastically changes. Where the Forgotten Crossroads felt like a place barely clinging to life, Green Path feels the exact opposite. The area is much more vibrant, filled with lush vegetations, and the music sounds more living, while still evoking the sense that this place is still filled with danger. And this goes for every area in Hollow Knight. From the fungal waste with mushrooms growing everywhere with a dark yellow background and yellow particles, to the crystal peak with crystals and mines and light pink color to represent the area, the dark blue atmosphere in City of Tears with supposed rain falling from above, with a very sad and somber soundtrack, making the area much more tragic yet memorable. Now, this alone is not what makes the world of Hollow Knight great, but rather how it is all interconnected. Hollow Knight isn't a very linear game like most Metroidvanias. It is a much more open-ended than other 2D games. To clarify this better, let's talk about Forgotten Crossroads. When you first enter the area, you are presented with many paths that loop in on themselves. And as you go into those paths, you'll come across places where you can't go yet. This elevator is a perfect example. When you come across this elevator, you'll start to wonder how to open it and where does it take you. You decide to leave this place for later and explore other places, and many moments later, while you're in City of Tears, you'll come across this place at the rooftop that acquires some geo to unlock something. So you give some geo and the same looking elevator descends from above. You decide to enter it to see where it takes you, and then once you get there, you realize that it was the same elevator that you couldn't get access to, and realize that the city was always below you. This is what makes the world of Hollow Knight incredible. Every area is connected to different areas, and you find yourself in awe of finding out how they are all connected in some way. Another factor that makes Hollow Knight's world great is how much open it is. What this means is that you are presented with many options of which area you want to go. Again, with Forgotten Crossroads, most people will go to Green Path as their next destination. But if you farm 1800 geo for a lamp, you can also go to the Crystal Peak very early in the game. Now this is a bit of an extreme example, so let's use a better one. Fungal Wastes. While you're in Fungal Wastes, you'll come across Hornet for the second time, where she starts running away and leaps over the Lake of Acid. So you go deep into the Fungal Wastes, and in Mantis Village you find a Mantis Claw, the ability that allows you to wall jump. So now you have an option as to how to get to Hornet. But there is another path. If you decide to find Mantis Lords and beat them, you'll unlock a brand new zone, Deep Nest. This is where the player is presented with two options. Do you go and follow Hornet, or go to this completely separate area you just unlocked? This is not just present in this moment. Some players will go to the Crystal Peak after unlocking the Desolate Dive that allows the knight to break the floors, while others will go to the Royal Waterways after finding the simple key to unlock the sewers. Some players will find Howling Cliffs very late into the game, while others will find it immediately after unlocking the wall jump. Someone's playthrough will be different from some other person's playthrough in some way, and the game isn't even afraid to completely hide some areas. I've seen some people criticize the game for hiding these areas without knowing that they were even there. When I first beaten the game, I thought that I found everything, that there is no area left to be discovered. Then later I found out that I completely missed like 4 different areas. I was surprised that they were willing to hide such important places. But this isn't a bad thing. I would argue that hiding an area like Kingdom's Edge, Hive, and Queen's Garden is more rewarding for the players who do find them on their first playthrough. And the bigger reason as to why this is a good thing is that it makes the world feel more alive. Not everything has to be discovered immediately or told that there is a secret behind a wall. Finding out that there is still more to the world than you already know is something that can absolutely blow the player's mind in the best way possible. So far, Hollow Knight's world design does a lot of things just right. But there are a couple of more things to mention, like the environmental storytelling. I'm sure you've already heard about this sentence, so I won't be going over as to what it means. There are many points in Hollow Knight where the things aren't directly told you as to what happened in this place and why are some things like that. Instead, the player must come to the logical conclusion as to why is the specific thing here or how is something possible to happen. The most notable one would be the rain in City of Tears. You might ask yourself like, How is it possible that there is rain falling in this place when you are deep underground? But later you'll find the blue lake, and when you look at the map, you'll see that the lake is directly above the city, suggesting that there are probably cracks in the ceiling where the city is, and that is the cause of the supposed rain falling. The second example would be in Kingdom's Edge. There are two questions in players' mind when they walk into this area. First one is, how is it now snowing, and how the hell is that even possible? And the second one would be, why are there so many corpses of armored bugs just falling from the sky? Who the hell is throwing these corpses? And this is also more satisfying once you connect the dots. But what about the inhabitants of Hollow Nest? How do they impact the storytelling that Hollow Knight goes for? The perfect example of this would be this specific Moss Knight at the Lake of Un. Previous Moss Knights you fought in Green Path were very much hostile towards you, except for this one, who is for some reason not attacking you unless you provoke him first, but also is facing directly at the lake as if something is calling him. There are many more examples of this where you are not directly told as to what is the thing that you are looking at. Of course, the game isn't something like Hyperlight Drifter's storytelling. In Hyperlight Drifter, there is no written dialogue or text to explain to you as to what is happening in the world. If you want more details on that game specifically, then I think you should watch Zingus's video on that matter. Hollow Knight does have fully written dialogue and some explanations here and there, but they are not overwhelming to the point where the player won't even pay attention to it. Hollow Knight's colorful cast of characters and enemy variety is another factor that helps tremendously into crafting this world. With the exception of Howling Cliffs, every single area is filled with so many variations of enemies that help strengthen the theming of each area. Hive is obviously filled with bees, bee soldiers and guardians, Crystal Peak is filled with miners endlessly mining for crystals, and Deep Nest is a home to spiders and centipedes that will make sure to tell you that they don't want you here. And for last, I want to talk about Hollow Knight's spectacular soundtrack. If you are talking about Hollow Knight or reviewing it, you just can't glance over Christopher Larkin's amazing soundtrack. The soundtrack as a whole is filled with somber and relaxing melodies that also features some chaotic battle themes for bosses. Dirtmouth's music is represented as a peaceful track that tells you you are safe from dangers of this kingdom. Soundtrack for each area is very fitting for the theming, the atmosphere and the tone of each area and can sometimes create such memorable moments in the game. Let's look at the City of Tears again, as this is one of the most iconic moments in the whole game. When you enter the area, you are presented with dark blue palette, sounds of water droplets falling from above, and the piano that is playing in the background, and it all comes together when you leave the building and finally enter into the heart of Hollow Nest. Now the piano is combined with strings and beautiful singing that strikes the beauty of this fallen city. There are more moments like this where the music will fully kick in to make a certain scene or a moment much more powerful. So I talked about the world design for some time, but for what purpose? Because a good world design can heavily affect your enjoyment of the game you are playing. In case of Metroidvanias, good world design can also heavily affect other aspects, like exploration, combat, and the lore. Which perfectly leads me to the next segment. Now let's look at other aspects that Hollow Knight excels at, the combat and the exploration. No matter what, whenever you start playing any action game, not just 2D ones, combat can play a massive role of the overall experience. Here we will just focus on 2D games. I said this in the past, but the combat in 2D action games can be really hard to get it just right. Sometimes some animations aren't as smooth as the rest of the game's animations are. Maybe moment-to-moment gameplay isn't engaging enough. And even if the game can manage to do all of these things right, you'll still get a select few people that'll criticize the game's combat for being unoriginal, or that is simple and not complex. I bring this last point up because Hollow Knight's combat is very simple on surface level, and the mechanics aren't something that you haven't seen. But this is not a bad thing. While the combat and mechanics are simple, they are very responsive, easy to learn, fair, and don't feel clunky or terrible. But let's go deeper into Hollow Knight's mechanics, starting with the combat itself. Like I said, this game's combat is pretty simple. You can attack by just pressing the button, you can jump, you can dash, throw a magic projectile, you can heal, and that's kinda it. And here's something that I didn't mention. When starting the game for the first time, you don't get the dash and spell, you unlock them later. And I don't mean like you'll unlock it 3 minutes later. It can take you an hour or two to get those abilities. So you're just left with jumping and slashing enemies. This is something that might seem like a huge issue to make the game this slow. And this is another thing that everyone points out, how the first hours are way too slow. But I don't see it entirely that way. Sure, some parts could have been cut shorter, I will give you that. But the main reason as to why I don't agree with this statement is because of how fluid the combat is and how the game teaches you with its mechanics. The game's controls are extremely responsive since every action happens immediately. There is no delay between the input and action, it all happens very quickly. When I press the button for attack, the dash or the double jump, it all happens immediately and it's always a treat to just look at it, which is very vital because of the various challenges the game presents. But there is also another mechanic that game doesn't directly tell you about, and that mechanic is called pogoing. This is a mechanic that can be a bit difficult to master but is extremely rewarding in the long run. Pogoing is performed when you attack and hold the directional button down. That way you'll be able to hit something downward. And if you hit an enemy or an object, you'll go slightly upwards. And if you've unlocked double jump or dash, it will be reset once you pogo onto something. This mechanic can be extremely helpful against some deadly foes and some challenging platforming segments that the game will occasionally throw at you. Now let's start by talking about the first area again. Forgotten Crossroads is one of the best designed starting zones in any game. Not the best, but still incredible nonetheless. Enemies like Vengeflies, Grozzers, and Tic-Tics teach you about spatial control. Husks are a common enemy throughout the game that will attack you the moment they see you. Husk warriors will tell you that enemies with shields need to be approached differently than just spamming the attack button until you kill it, since they can block the incoming attack. While Husk guards are a much tougher enemies that must be approached very carefully, as even a slightest mistake can lead to your downfall. And Aspids tell you that no matter how annoying an enemy can be, it can always be worse. And then you come across your first boss in Hollow Knight, the False Knight. This is an excellent first boss that will push you to your limit. When you see the boss for the first time, you might be intimidated due to the size of the boss. But if you keep your composure and learn his attacks and the timing to attack him back, you'll take down the boss in no time. What makes False Knight so good as a first boss is that he sets the bar for what to expect with Hollow Knight's bosses. Bosses will have several attacks that you need to learn to dodge, and you must find the right opportunities to either heal or fight back. I'll talk about the other bosses in full detail much later in the video. For now, know that this first area and this first boss set the stage for what's to come. I mentioned that finding the right opportunity to heal is very important earlier. I want to briefly talk about healing. Healing is pretty simple. You must stay in place to heal your masks by using soul. The twist here is how you get soul. Soul can be earned by hitting an enemy, which will fill this orb on your top left corner of the screen. Once you collect enough, you can then perform the heal. This means that you have the infinite source of healing. But the challenge here is to find the right timing to heal yourself, as the enemies and bosses will make sure that you can't just tank everything and heal, as the healing process can take a second or two. Not to mention that using spells also costs soul, so it becomes a bit of a gamble. Do you use your soul to heal yourself, or do you use it to throw a spell at the enemy or a boss? The charm system is a very crucial aspect of the game. Charms represent as additional buffs to the knight. And I don't mean in like increased health or damage, although there are two charms that do just that. More specifically, charms can alter the playstyle depending on which charm you are using. Do you want to hit faster and wider? Mark of Pride and Quick Slash do that. Feel like you need to heal faster? Quick Focus does just that. Want to cosplay like a summoner? Here, use these charms. More powerful charms will cost more charm notches, depending on the strength of it. What is also cool about this system is that some charm behaviors can be slightly changed when you combine two charms together. Combining Defender's Crest with Fluke Nest will make you fire one giant fluke instead of a couple of small ones. I also want to mention how adorable it is when you sit on a bench and after some time your little minions will lay down to take a short nap. It's a tiny little detail that adds some character to these little guys. But in order to get some of these charms, you must find them in the first place, which leads me to my next point. How good is Hollow Knight's exploration? Exploration is a key aspect of a Metroidvania, since it can affect not only the enjoyment but also the difficulty of a game. Since Hollow Knight's world is much larger than any other Metroidvania, you bet that the exploration will play a huge role. You'll find some mask fragments, vessel fragments, charms, some trinkets to sell for more geo, charm notches, or finding these spore grubs that are stuck in vases. What I love about Hollow Knight's exploration in particular is how game will award you if you go out of your way to explore everything. Sometimes it won't just be another charm or mask fragment. Maybe you'll find a secret optional boss, or even crazier, a brand new area. Hive is an obvious example here. When you first see bees flying around in Kingdom's Edge, you'll want to know how to get into their home. Many hours later, in Deep Nest, you'll find a tram pass that'll allow you to use trams. And if you use this one, you will arrive again at Kingdom's Edge, and you'll see bees again, suggesting that there must be a way to enter the hive. And if you pay attention, you'll see that this wall has some cracks on it. You break the wall and your reward for your thorough exploration is the new area. On the topic of these walls, I want to mention that I love how there are subtle details on them that can tell you that you can break them and can reward the player for paying attention around the environment. And you'll never know what's behind some of these walls. It might be some geo, a new charm, it could be some details on the lore, or it could be a full-on boss battle. If you haven't figured it out by now, Hollow Knight's exploration is great and will always reward the player for exploring as much as they can. because if you don't explore enough, you might get stuck on a certain boss or a level. This actually happened to me when I played the game for the first time. I had like 7 masks and upgraded my nail only once, and I had like a couple of charms, and I was really struggling on one of the bosses. After dying like 30 times, I decided I need to explore more. So, after upgrading my nail once more, finding many different charms and charm notches, I went back to the boss that I was struggling, and in 4 attempts, I came victorious. This is a moment that really stuck with me since I was rewarded for exploring the world more thoroughly than before. Speaking of the bosses, I think it's finally time to talk about Hollow Knight's boss roster. Hollow Knight has a lot of bosses. If we don't include the DLCs that were later added with more bosses, and if we don't include mini bosses, the game has in total 30 bosses. Having this many bosses in a game can be a detriment, since there is a high chance that like over half of them would be unmemorable or simply not fun to fight. This can be applied to any game that is centered around bosses. Yet somehow, Hollow Knight doesn't fall into this trap. There are still some bosses that aren't particularly well designed, but I would argue that almost every boss in this game is memorable in some way, whether it is their cool design, the challenges they provide, or their lore being tragic and interesting. The way Hollow Knight incorporates the encounters with them is slightly different from other Metroidvanias. What I mean by this is that the bosses don't capstone each area. Sometimes in some areas you'll have multiple boss encounters instead of just one boss to kill and never return to this area. Again, for I think third or fourth time, let's use Forgotten Crossroads again. There is an obvious boss that you need to defeat, but there is also Gruzmother and Brooding Malek if you want more bosses to fight. That's another thing. Most of the bosses are optional if you only want to beat the game. You don't need to fight Mantis Lords to get to Deepnest. You can just go the other way around. This goes back to a point I made earlier, that everyone will have a slightly different playthrough than someone else. And the game isn't even afraid to hide some of these bosses, which is kind of a bold thing to do but can pay off in a long run. Stumbling upon a boss that most people missed out on is a great thing and can leave a big impact on those who went out of their way to find them in the first place. Now I won't go into full details on every boss in Hollow Knight, since there are so many and it would take me an insane amount of time. So I'll be briefly going through them, with few exceptions. I mentioned how False Knight sets the stage for what's to come with the bosses. They'll have attacks that you need to memorize in your head and find the right opportunity to attack them. So let's start with Hornet. Hornet is the second main boss that'll test you to your absolute limit. False Knight was much slower and easy to read, while Hornet is quick and agile and forces you to react to her every move. Attacks are simple: the lunge, throwing the needle and returning it back to her, the air lunge, and the spiral attack. The attacks themselves are easy to dodge, but the challenge here is to react to them as fast as you can, and Hornet loves to trick the player sometimes. Hornet jumps a lot, and often she will use her lunging attack mid-air, but sometimes instead of the lunge attack, she will use the spiral net to throw players off guard. Many first-time players get stuck on this boss and even give up since she was too fast. But this is the boss that really prepares you for future challenges. Where False Knight was an easy boss that teaches you basic mechanics, Hornet pushes those mechanics to their limit at this point in the game and prepares you for future challenges. Mantis Lords is another great example of an early challenge that is difficult but very much fair. Starting the fight with one Mantis where you learn various attacks like lunges, stabs from above and throwing discs. Fighting this one Mantis isn't hard, but the challenge comes once you defeat her, because now you have to fight two Mantises, forcing you to dash between them and avoid their combos, making this fight feel like a dance between you and the Lords. Soul Master, Dung Defender, and Broken Vessel are all great bosses that test your patience and skills in order to take them down. I will say some bosses are pretty easy. The Crystal Guardian, I'm looking at you, but so far bosses are pretty solid. But then we have the refight with Hornet in Kingdom's Edge, dubbed Hornet Sentinel. Remember when I said that I was stuck on a boss and died like 30 times? This is the boss that pushed me to my limit. The first battle with Hornet was tough enough, but Hornet Sentinel takes it to the next level. She doesn't particularly have new moves except for one new attack she gets in phase 2, but the difference is crystal clear. She is much faster than in her previous battle, and the downtime between her attacks is very small, meaning that you don't have many options for healing until you knock her down. This is the fight where it forced me to explore more since I wasn't exploring that much prior to this encounter, and even then it took me 4 more attempts to finally beat her, and despite this being the toughest boss I faced up to that point, I adored every second of it. Not once did it ever feel unfair, rather I could see what hit me and how I should have avoided that attack. This is also the fight that forced me to alter my playstyle in sense of if I want to come on top, I must be just as fast as her. Despite not having any new attacks besides the spikes she puts on the wall, making sure you pay attention to your footing, Hornet Sentinel is an absolutely beautiful fight, and if we don't include the DLCs, she is the best main game boss. This fight also prepares you yet again for future challenges, since now fights will be just as fast, if not faster, than Hornet Sentinel. Lost Kin, Failed Champion, and Soul Tyrant are excellent reuse of previously fought bosses, only much faster and are more altered to make the fights different than the last time you encountered them. Failed Champion is the best example of this, since now he deals 2 masks of damage instead of 1 and is much more aggressive than the first time you fought him. Traitor Lord and the Hive Knight are 2 optional bosses that are also extremely aggressive yet always feel fair and fun to fight. However, not every boss in this game is great. There are bosses that are not well designed. Flukmore is such an obvious case here, but I wouldn't consider her the worst. Instead, that goes to Markoth. The problem with Markoth is that he is entirely based on RNG. His attacks consist of throwing swords and spinning his shield around, and then in second phase adding another shield and throwing more swords. The issue here comes with RNG. Sometimes Markoth will keep running away from you while he throws swords that can appear anywhere in the arena. They can sometimes even appear out of your viewpoint to get a cheap hit on you, but sometimes Markoth will be consistently going towards you, and since you take damage from simply touching him, it can be very frustrating. Even his shield is inconsistent as it can start spinning the other direction. I know Dream Warriors aren't the best bosses in the game, but they are at least not frustrating to fight like Markoth. The boss is at least optional, but it doesn't excuse how terribly designed the boss is. On the other spectrum, Nosk is not a bad boss, he's just kind of disappointing. Besides Galleon, this is the only boss in Deep Nest who is hidden behind a wall. And the build-up is absolutely brilliant, and the design is probably the coolest one in the game. But the fight itself is very easy and even easier to cheese. The reward is at least good. But let's get back to the bright side. I think it's time to talk about the final boss of this game. However, I won't be going over just the boss itself. I'll be also going over the lore for this boss and some other things that are found near the end of the game. So from this point onward, I'll be going into serious spoiler territory. If you haven't gotten the true ending of Hollow Knight, click off now and come back once you experience it for yourself. Or skip here where I talk about the DLCs. The final boss of Hollow Knight is one of the most tragic characters in media. When the infection began, Pale King sought to find a way to stop the spread of it, and so he created a vessel that can contain the source. He created the Hollow Knight. But this process required to sacrifice thousands of children to be filled with void, and only one was chosen for this role. The child was trained to its absolute prime and even grew the attachment towards its parents. Hollow Knight sacrificed himself to stop the infection from spreading. He wanted to save this kingdom from this doom, but it was a failure. The infection was still spreading, killing thousands of innocent bugs. The Pale King hid his palace and he stayed there until his eventual demise, while the Hollow Knight was rotting away for eternity. When first starting the game, you obviously don't know who this person is and why are they chained up. You get the glimpse of them for a short second before the cutscene fades to black. But remembering this detail is very important. Once you are in City of Tears, you'll come across this fountain with the statue of a person named Hollow Knight. And if you remembered the look of the person in the opening cutscene, you'll quickly connect the dots. Once you kill all three dreamers, you'll gain access to the Black Egg, a pitch-black room filled with mysteriously shaped pillars with a creepy ambience playing in the background. Once you reach the end, you come face to face with the same chained person. As you break each chain, the adrenaline in music rises more and more until you break the final set of chains. Now you fight the Hollow Knight himself, who despite being taken over by the infection still fights you until one of you fall. The fight is very simple yet very much challenging, consisting of 3-slash combos, the lunge, summoning pillars of fire and spewing infection from his wound. It can be challenging to handle all of his attacks, but still very much fair. And the music being the twisted remake of the main theme is a brilliant way to end the game on. But of course, this boss has the phase 2, but instead of second phase being epic and bombastic with full of hype, this is what happens. The tone in music shifts drastically with Hollow Knight continuously stabbing himself, and new attacks he gains are brutal, not in the sense of difficulty, but rather as if the infection itself is trying to forcefully leave the body and kill the player. Hollow Knight stabbing himself can be seen as either him trying to put himself out of the misery, or that he is helping the player succeed where he failed. And in the third phase, he just completely gives up, barely able to swing his weapon or walk. The music towards the end reaches its absolute peak as you, the player, start absorbing the infection, ending the Hollow Knight's suffering for good. I love this fight. Sure, it is not the most complex fight mechanically, but the emotional weight of the fight and its excellent soundtrack is enough to make Hollow Knight one of the best final bosses in gaming. Or at least, that's what I thought before facing the real final boss. The infection itself is the biggest question that players want to know. Who actually caused this infection? It didn't just come out of nowhere, right? When you unlock Dreamnail, you'll meet a new friendly NPC named Seer, who will tell you that the Dreamnail's current state is weak, but she is willing to help you fix it to its true power by collecting essence. You might have noticed that Seer is a moth, and only moth you see that is alive in the game. While you are exploring other parts of the map for essence and other stuff, while you are in Crystal Peak at the top of the mountain, you'll come across this statue. You've seen the statue of Hollow Knight and Pale King, but this statue is of someone you've never heard of before. Even more mysterious is if you dreamnail the statue out of curiosity, it will say, "Remember light." This is a very significant line, as some characters like Myla, before she got fully taken over by infection, kept saying the word light. And the look of this person is very much reminiscing of a moth. At this point, players might come to the conclusion that this person is in some way responsible for the infection. Once you collect 1800 essence, you'll get fully awoken Dreamnail, and Seer will say that no dreams could hide now. So you go back to the Hollow Knight to try using Dreamnail on him, but you still can't enter his mind. Realizing this, you go back to exploring the world more to try and find any clue as to how to enter the Hollow Knight's mind. And eventually, in Queen's Garden, you'll come face to face with the Queen of Hollow Nest, the White Lady. White Lady will tell you how there are two paths of preserving Hollow Nest, either taking the place as the new vessel for the infection, or going beyond that, facing the heart of the infection. She then gives you a white fragment and tells you that it needs a second half to be fully functional. While trying to think where the second half could be, you remember that there was a corpse in white armor that couldn't be hit with the regular Dreamnail. So you go back there and enter the dream of this night. And then you finally enter the White Palace. If I were to say what is my favorite area in Hollow Knight, White Palace would probably be at the top. The somber music playing in the background, the beautiful architecture of the palace with great use of white and light blue that is sometimes contrasted with heavy black makes this one of the most beautiful areas in the whole game. Now, the area itself isn't combat focused like you were led to believe. Instead, the main gimmick here is the platforming. This is something that the game has been building up to. Platforming was challenging but also very simple once you know what to do. White Palace takes it to the next level. Buzzsaws going left and right, spears coming out of the ground and spikes being splattered everywhere forces you to be very much careful than usual. Bomb rushing through this area is very punishing, so instead you must take it slowly and time your double jumps and dashes to avoid spikes and buzzsaws. The game also did an amazing job building up this area story-wise as well, as you always wondered as to how could an entire palace just disappear. Once you get past through all the brutal gauntlets in the White Palace, you finally enter the throne room and find the Pale King sitting on his throne. But he is dead, with the last thoughts being no cost too great. You hit his corpse couple times and he falls off the throne, dropping the second half of White Fragment. You pick it up and now you have obtained King's Soul Charm. You leave the palace with the line saying, "Soul of Root, Soul of Worm, Heart of Void." Side note, if you sit on the throne before picking up the White Fragment, you'll hear a brief music of Hollow Knight's main theme, but now playing with much softer piano, that could be symbolizing the hope of saving Hallownest. Reading the description of King's Soul will tell you that it opens the way to a birthplace, in other words, Abyss, a place where the Knight and thousands of its siblings were born. You go back to the Abyss, where the ground starts to shake and opens a new path for you, where you find the shell of an egg being completely taken over by the void. Looking into the egg, you see your reflection. You strike the egg with the dream nail and enter into your own mind. Only this time you're not teleported to a new location. Instead, you wake up in the past, when the Knight and its siblings were born. While climbing up, you'll occasionally get different lines of dialogue like "Born of God" and "Void." As you are nearing the top, the music starts to intensify more and more, and then this is a very crucial moment in the game. This is the moment where the Knight comes to terms with its tragic past and how the Knight was abandoned to rot in the Abyss among its other siblings. After all this effort, you return to fight the Hollow Knight, where Hornet helps you in this fight, and now you are finally able to enter Hollow Knight's dream, and you come face to face with the source of the infection, the Radiance. The true final boss of Hollow Knight, the culprit behind the infection, one that was responsible for destroying an entire civilization. Radiance is a very tough battle, not just because of the double damage, but also because of her attacks requiring you to dodge them in a very specific way, and fight becomes more and more challenging. You first fight her on this large platform, but later half of the platform gets covered in spikes, and the second phase is by far the most difficult part, as you have to jump on a bunch of small platforms while still worrying about her deadly attacks. Once you deal enough damage to her, the final phase starts, where you must climb to the top to deal the final blow, putting an end to the Hollow Knight's suffering and destroying the Radiance once and for all. For the sake of clarity, I will be saying DLC instead of free content pack in this section. Just know that because I'll be using this word a lot. After Hollow Knight was released, in the span of a year and a half, it received 3 completely free DLCs. Well, technically 4, but the Lifeblood update was more of a quality of life update that fixed certain charms and bosses. The first DLC that was released is called Hidden Dreams. There's really not much to talk about here. It added 2 new bosses, refight with Dung Defender dubbed the White Defender, and the fight with terrifying, beautiful, powerful, passionate, gorgeous, overwhelming, diligent, vigorous, enchanting, mysterious, sensual, fearless, invincible Grey Prince Zod. Sorry, I just love this intro. And it also added another way to teleport around the map with Dreamnail. There's not much to talk about here. These 2 bosses are great, Dreamgate is a great addition to the game and not much else. I should also point out that you can fight these 2 bosses multiple times and they'll be harder and harder the more you fight them. Pretty solid first DLC, but the next DLC is much more interesting. The Grim Troop was released shortly after the Hidden Dreams and offers more content. Main selling point of this DLC is an entirely new questline revolving around Grim, as he asks you to collect flames from different locations on the map and feed it to Grimchild. While this is tedious to run around the map collecting these flames, the reward is very much worth it. After you collect 6 flames, you'll get to fight Grim himself. Grim is a very tough fight. His speed and his aggression are as fast, if not faster, than Hornet Sentinel. Grim has around 5 to 6 attacks he can dish out, and they are more complex than any other boss. His uppercut / combo is always followed with the flames falling from above. His dive attack is followed by the lunge, forcing you to jump over it. The bat spawn is simple, but if you come too close to him, he will teleport behind you with a surprise bat spawn. Grim will also go into this phase where you can't deal damage to him for a short time, as he will throw a bunch of orbs that need to be safely avoided. This fight can be really difficult when you fight him for the first time, but if you take your time to learn his combos, you will beat Grim in no time. This fight is awesome. Dodging Grim's different combos and avoiding his bullet hell phases makes it feel like a literal dance. Beating Grim will award you with the Charm Notch and he will send you on another fetch quest. Only this time the player will have 2 options. There are now 4 flames instead of 3 on the map. If you go to Deep Nest, you will find Braum, who will give you an offer to banish the Grim Troop from Hollow Nest. Here's my advice. Don't do that, because not only will you get one of the worst charms in the game, but you will also miss the refight with Grim. Nightmare King Grim is one of the most difficult bosses I've ever faced. Grim was fast, but the Nightmare King takes it to the next level. Not only is his aggression doubled, not only does he have new attacks, not only are his old attacks altered in some way, not only is his health bigger, but he deals 2 masks of damage. Oh yeah, you need to equip Grimchild in order to fight him, so you have -2 charm slots. Not only that, but because of his aggression, your time windows to heal are extremely minimal. Luckily, like many bosses in Hollow Knight, he will get staggered, but only for a brief moment. If you want to beat Nightmare King, you have to learn to dodge his attacks. Dodge through his uppercut / combo and position yourself right next to him to avoid the flames. Dodge away from the dive and then double jump over his lunge attack. Avoid first 3 pillars of fire and deal as much damage as possible when the final flame shows up. and learn to time your jumps in the bullet hell phase. While this is no doubt one of the hardest bosses in this game, it's just impossible to hate this fight. Every single move, while challenging to learn to avoid, always feels fair, and the adrenaline-inducing soundtrack makes this one of the best fights in the entire game. Defeating Nightmare King is one of the most challenging things in Hollow Knight that is very much worth doing. The final DLC that was released was Godmaster. This DLC is mostly focused on bosses, refighting bosses over and over again. The DLC contains 4 separate boss rushes that end with a brand new boss. This DLC also adds another way to refight some of the earlier bosses, and you can make them harder. I won't be talking about new bosses because this DLC is pretty much tied to the separate ending. Plus, I want to leave this as a surprise to those who haven't played this game yet. This DLC also provides the ultimate boss rush, where you have to fight every single boss in Hollow Knight without dying, and it also ends with the hardest boss in the whole game. This is a brutal gauntlet that is luckily optional, but designed specifically to those who want to be tested one last time. It should be very obvious to you that I fully recommend Hollow Knight. Game's tone and atmosphere has a lot of character and charm unlike anything I've played. The world design is marvelously crafted, and finding new secrets every now and then always felt great. The combat, while simple on paper, is polished to such a high degree than most other games in the same genre. Soundtrack is memorable, the boss roster is insanely good, and the lore is interesting and grabs your attention into finding out more about this world. Combining all of this, you get the game that you'll likely never experience again in your life. But there is another reason as to why Hollow Knight is my favorite game and is much more personal. I haven't mentioned that I played this game around the beginning of April in the year 2020. And you should know what was happening to the world in that year. During that time, I felt more isolated than ever before, and my mental health was not in a good spot because of all the stress that was happening. One day I remembered watching a video on best bosses of the decade, and while watching the video, a boss from Hollow Knight showed up on that list. When I first saw that, I knew that I had to give this game a try. And after I've beaten the game, then getting the true ending of it, I fell in love with this game, and it helped me get through those tough times. I still remember when I was in awe after finally reaching City of Tears and hearing that absolutely beautiful music. Beating bosses like Hornet and Nightmare King Grim after many hours of attempts felt like a big accomplishment. And I nearly teared up when I finally got the true ending and saved Hallownest from the wrath of the infection. This game also, in a weird way, allowed me to find so many other great indie games. That sounds a bit ridiculous in a way, but I do wholeheartedly mean that. This game made me fall in love with indie genre, and I've managed to find other great indie games that also left some sort of impact on me. I probably wouldn't have played games like Hyper Light Drifter, Rain World, and Omori, 3 other games that are also very close to my heart. Ever since I've started making videos on this channel, I've always wanted to make a video on Hollow Knight. And while my takes aren't anything you haven't heard before, I just wanted to share my thoughts as to why I love this game so much. Hollow Knight is a game that will always be close to me, and I will always remember it very fondly. There is nothing more to say than thank you, Team Cherry, and thank you, Hollow Knight.